Hello everybody, my name is María Martínez-Ordaz. I am a philosopher of science working at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. I work in the intersection of philosophy of science, epistemology, and logic, especially non-classical logics, for the study of scientific reasoning in defective contexts. And today I'm very happy to talk to you about how adaptive logics can help us to study scientific reasoning. So in order to do something like that, I'm going to start sharing my screen. That said, the plan for today is going to be the following. First, I'm just going to motivate why the study of inconsistent information, defective information in general, is important for us. Then I'm going to do a brief recap of the philosophy behind adaptive logics. And then I will focus on the rational use of defective, in this particular case, inconsistent information in the sciences. And I'm going to relate three main elements of this practice to adaptive logics to see if they are good for us when working with this. And then I'm just going to say some final remarks. Let's go. The rational use of defective information, in particular, inconsistent information in the sciences. So, we have the following intuition. Science is one of the most rational enterprises that humans have. So, while we are not sure about our epistemic practices in our daily life, we actually know that science is very reliable because the practice is, in a sense, very rational, the practice behind science. And so, in a different and very independent intuition, we have that defective information, data that is vague, partial, conflicted, inconsistent, false, or even impossible, and we know it to be so, is unreliable, so we shouldn't trust it. If I find that my friend has been lying for years, then I stop trusting whatever she says, or at least I stop trusting the things that she said for all these years. So when we combine intuitions 1 and 2, what we have is the following disjunction. Either scientists work with and reason from defective information, but they are not justifying trust in it, and ergo they are rational, or they are rational and they avoid the defective information in their practice as much as possible, or all the time. Nonetheless, we have evidence, independent evidence from the history of science that shows that scientists do work with and reason from defective information in their practice, still remains rational. And so, how can we make sense of this? How can we make sense of the continuous trust placed by scientists in inconsistent information in the sciences consistently with ascribing rationality to them? What I will say right now is that there are going to be three different types of reasoning, three different elements involved in the reasoning of the rational use of inconsistent information, and all these three elements are going to be successfully scrutinizable through adaptive logics. So let's go to a brief recap of adaptive logics. By the way, there is a video in this series by Christian Strasser that is an introduction to adaptive logics, which I recommend you to watch first before this one. So adaptive logics were initially a special brand of paraconsistent logics that were discovered around 1980. And they were expected to allow for inconsistencies but presuppose the consistency of all sentences unless and until proven otherwise. Interpreting a theory as consistently as possible, they adapt to specific inconsistencies that occur in it. Adaptive logics were invented or discovered, how you want to call it, by Batens, as I was saying, in the 80s. And so, from the quote that I just read to you, we have the intuition that adaptive logics are focusing on portraying defeasible reasoning, and ergo they are going to be non-monotonic logics. So the main application context that led to the first adaptive logics was a specific kind of creative problem-solving processes in the presence of inconsistencies. And so the context that Batens had in mind when providing us with the first adaptive logics was the following. We have a theory team that is composed by a set of axioms, of non-logical axioms, gamma, and a logic L. The logical closure of gamma is going to be determined by the logic L that we chose. And so if T was intended to be as consistent, L will presumably be something like classical logic or classical logic. Sometimes, however, when gamma is a scientific set of information, L would turn out to be inadequate with respect to T, because gamma would violate some of the presuppositions of L, especially if we chose classical logic. So in the case that L is classical logic, the inadequacy often surfaces in the form of an inconsistency, and hence of the triviality of the theory. So that said, what we would find in the sciences is the following scenario. In an abstract sense, we would be inclined to say that there are good reasons to search for a consistent replacement of gamma, an inconsistent set of descriptions or explanations about a particular phenomenon, rather than for a replacement of the logic. Nonetheless, especially if the theory is a valuable theory because of gamma, one will look for a way to provisionally live with the theory. Moreover, in the search for a replacement, scientists would not start from scratch, but rather reason from the theory that they have, even if they already know that it's inconsistent. So, how this should be interpreted in such cases was the problem that led to inconsistency adaptive logics. That said, an adaptive logic might be characterized by a triplet. First, the lower limit logic, which is going to be a logic that is the most stable part of the adaptive logic. And this logic has to be reflexive, transitive, monotonic, and compact, that has a characteristic semantics. A set of abnormalities that we are going to determine beforehand, and a strategy that we are also going to choose beforehand. The most standard strategies are minimal abnormality, if you want to be very conservative, of reliability, if you want to be more relaxed about what you want to get. Intuitively, the lower limit logic, as I was saying, is a stable part of the adaptive logic, the part that it's not subject to any adaptation. A logic is adaptive if and only if it adapts itself to the specific premises to which it is applied. But this shouldn't be confused with saying that adaptive logics are going to be informed by, for instance, our feelings or our psychological inclinations. But the reason will not have anything to do in this. The logic is defined by a set of rules as well as by a semantics, but lead to the adaptive effect, independently of any decision of the human or machine that applies the rules. Unlike classical logic, an adaptive logic would prevent inconsistencies from leading to triviality. Unlike monotonic paraconsistent logics, they interpret an inconsistent set of premises as consistently as possible, and this is the secret of adaptive logics. Now, moving forward to the use of inconsistent information in the sciences and the three elements that are crucial when studying it. So, first of all, the basics of inconsistency toleration. Take a contradiction to be a pair of propositions where one is the negation of the other, and we have the intuition that when you find a contradiction, the two elements that are part of it are mutually exclusive. We also have a principle of explosion, which is one of the most characteristic principles of any explosive logic, including, of course, classical logic. It says that in any theory, if claused under an explosive logical consequence relation, would trivialize when containing a contradiction. And a trivial theory is such that in which any proposition is a theorem. So we want to avoid the presence of contradictions in theories that are claused under classical or explosive logical consequence relations, because we want to avoid the presence of triviality. And so inconsistency toleration is the phenomenon of working with inconsistent information without threatening one's rationality, in particular without reaching triviality from having a contradiction in your theory. Now, if inconsistency toleration is a rational practice, philosophers, epistemologists, and logicians should explain the following. First, under which circumstances scientists would be rationally inclined to tolerate such a contradiction, and second, how they could preserve sensible reasoning when using inconsistent information. Well, the first part has been often been addressed by epistemologists by saying that scientists are not trusting or relying on both parts of the contradiction equally, and that one is, for instance, an idealization, abstraction, and a fiction, and the other is something that we believe to be true, or also an abstraction and idealization, among others. The second part has been often addressed by logicians, in particular by paraconsistent logicians, as it has a more inferential nature. So if we want to test adaptive logics and how they can do in these two tasks, how well can they do in this job, we have to ask adaptive logics three things before having any conclusions about it. First, that they are able to tackle human reasoning as we think intuitively it is, that they are able to tackle scientific reasoning, that it's not only human but has other elements, and also, and only then, if they are good when dealing with inconsistency toleration in the scientific reasoning. And so, first of all, what is needed when talking about human reasoning? We have this consensus that most reasoning is divisible, most human reasoning. And this means that divisible reasoning forms are not going to be candidates for the standard form of deduction. So we need logics that are divisible and that are deductive or are not focusing especially or only on truth preservation. Logics characterizing divisible reasoning forms require dynamic proofs, because we want to see what is happening when we realize that something is a contradiction or that we have an inconsistency in our set of information, and what we are going to do from that. We don't want only to have the end result, because we are scrutinizing the reasoning itself. So we want to have all these tools. And adaptive logics rank very well in these aspects. Inconsistency adaptive logics are non-monotonic. This is, adding premises might render some consequences underivative. This is as expected if A or B and not A are derivable from a theory, but A is not, we want B to be derivable. If, however, A is added to the theory, the above is disjunctive syllogism, right? If, however, A is added to the theory, we want B not to be derivable anymore. If applied to a consistent set of premises, adaptive logics deliver exactly the same consequences as classical logics. If applied to an inconsistent set, then, except from some limit cases, adaptive logics deliver more consequences at the corresponding monotonic paraconsistent logics, but less than classical logics. So they are in between, and they are closer to what our intuition is of how we reason with defective, especially with inconsistency in science. So that's good. That said, adaptive logics, of course, they can portray divisible reasoning. They have nothing to do with truth preservation in the stronger sense. They have dynamic proofs, and final derivability can only be established by meta-level considerations. But what makes adaptive logics better suited than other divisible logics, or non-monotonic logics in general, for modeling scientific reasoning? And the basic idea is that adaptive logics were initially motivated to address non-monotonicity and this type of creative problem-solving processes in the presence of inconsistency. So what they were doing were trying to portray the phenomena that often occurs in science, in which something is taken to be true unless proven otherwise. And so the problem-solving processes that Batens had in mind are the following type. They are contextual, and they include a problem, participants, this is the reasoners that are trying to solve that problem, certainties, the grounds from which they reason, but not necessarily things that are going to be true forever in the reasoning, special relations between the problem and other elements of the theory, and special methodologies. These methodologies can be portrayed by the strategies that we choose, either conservative strategies such as minimal abnormality, or more liberal strategies such as reliability. And the certainties might be portrayed also by the things that we consider to be abnormalities. So we might not know exactly which are going to be the consequences of our theory when working in science, but we know which are going to be the things that we are going to consider suspicious if they appear. So the certainties can be determined that way. And so in that sense, adaptive logics are going to rank very well in the scientific reasoning motivation as well. Now, what is behind inconsistency toleration and how adaptive logics can deal with it? Let's move to that. If we look at the work that has been done, or the literature that has been done regarding inconsistency toleration, one will find this thing that I like to call the generic explanation about why we tolerate contradictions despite knowing that they are not something really good in a reasoning. So, first of all, when having two scientific statements that contradict each other, especially in the empirical sciences, scientists tend to assume that at least one of them is false. Well, this is a quote from Loudon. It is a very well shared intuition. Now, if scientists are able to distinguish which of the conflicting propositions should be regarded as false, they would be able to explain how they could satisfactorily work on seemingly false information. We have a lot of literature on how we can rely on abstractions, idealizations, and fictions, and still be rational scientists. So that's the type of phenomena that here is assumed. However, most of the time, when confronted with an inconsistent set of information, scientists ignore at least which of the mutually contradictory statements should be regarded as false. Once this ignorance is acknowledged, if scientists have no better alternative to the inconsistent set of proposition, the toleration of the contradiction becomes the only option at hand, and such a tolerant attitude towards contradictions is often seen by scientists as a temporary resource, especially given the first premise. So the lessons that we can learn from this generic explanation is that, first of all, contradictions are not expected to be true, at least in empirical science. So that's going to be a very rare scenario. The second lesson is that scientists ignore at least the truth value of the two propositions. And so they are going to be expecting updates about that. They are going to be expecting an update that tells them whether P is true or not P is true, and so on. And the fact that they are looking for a better, especially a consistent alternative, but they don't have it at hand at the moment, suggests that there is a type of reliability about consistency, and that scientists are aiming at consistency in the long run. They are wanting to have a consistent version of the theory, or a consistent description of the phenomenon, or they want to get rid of the theory and get a consistent alternative to it. And so the three lessons that we learn, as I was saying, is contradictions are not expected to be true. Scientists will be expecting updates when dealing with and when tolerating inconsistencies in the sciences, and consistency is an ultimate goal. Such a tolerant attitude towards contradiction is often seen by scientists as a temporary resource, and that's the general claim behind this generic explanation. Now the question is, can adaptive logics portray this adequately? And so let's see. First, contradictions are not expected to be true. What about adaptive logics? Adaptive logics will place inconsistencies or contradictions in sets of abnormalities. So in that sense, they are not expecting them to be true, but to be something very abnormal going on in the reasoning, something that we have to pay attention to and that we should be suspicious about, at least partially. The strategy will also help us to realize how reliable we think contradictions are going to be, how damaging they might be in a particular context, among others. And this combined gives us the impression that adaptive logics are very sympathetic to the idea that contradictions are going to be temporarily tolerated. And on the other hand, we can compare adaptive logics to the total opposite alternative, which is going to be idealistic logic. And for them, contradictions are acceptable, but they are not only acceptable, they are thought to be true, at least some of them. And so because they are initially assumed to be true, they are not going to be compatible with this intuition of contradictions not expected to be true. So dialetheistic logics might work in other contexts, but when modeling scientific reasoning in inconsistent scenarios, dialetheistic logics would put a logical assumption or a philosophical assumption before the phenomena that we are trying to study. So that will make them go down. Now, the second part. We, as scientists or as human reasoners, are going to be expecting updates about the status of the contradiction that we are tolerating. So the contradiction might end up being false, but in very rare cases, we might have the intuition that the contradiction is actually true. And so that will lead to different roads. Either we reject the contradiction because we now know which is the false part, or we accept the contradiction because we know now that both parts are true. And this, in a sense, gives us a belief revision mechanism behind. This gives us a scenario in which, once we get new information, we revise whether we take the contradiction to be reliable or not. And adaptive logics can do well in this as well. So, adaptive logics have a dynamic proof theory. So, as we proceed in deriving consequences from the premises or the theory, we locate the inconsistencies and hence may have to review our previous judgment on what is derivable from the theory. So this is exactly the belief revision type of mechanism that we wanted to be reconstructed by the theory. So still, the final consequence set is stable and proof independent. In the long run, all proofs from a set of premises result in the same set of finally derived consequences. And this is something that we also wanted because we didn't want to give an explanation of our psychology, but how our reasoning is reliable as well. So this is good. But the dynamic proof procedure and the stable final consequence set is characterized by inadequate semantics. Inconsistency adaptive logics are non-monotonic, and in premises might render some consequences underivative. And in that sense, they are very close to this phenomenon that we were describing before. So, that said, adaptive logics, especially the set of abnormalities plus the strategy, are going to help us to see how these contradictions are going to be temporarily tolerated and how we are open to revise our commitments to them. In general, adaptive logics will allow us to work with defective information without necessarily accepting it to be true, for instance, or to accept it in a strong sense, in light of new evidence. Now, the role that consistency plays, the methodological role. We usually would say that this tolerant attitude towards contradiction is often seen by scientists as a temporary resource. This mainly because they want consistent alternatives or consistent versions of the theory that they are working with. This is especially stressed in Peter Vicker's books, Understanding Inconsistent Science. It's going to be linked in the description below. So, for the case of adaptive logics, consider a theory such as Frege's theory, that the author is supposed to be consistent, but later turned out to be inconsistent. We need a Paraconsistent logic in order to reason sensibly about such theory. However, replacing classical logic but by a completely different logic, such as a Paraconsistent one, is rather a drastic move. If the world is consistent, or if consistency is a justified methodological requirement, the same reasoning applies whenever our knowledge about the world is inconsistent. We want to safeguard our knowledge against triviality, but we also want to apply all rules of classical logic whenever the risk of triviality is absent. And this is the most important part. Precisely this is the fact is realized by inconsistency adaptive logics. So in that sense, we can say that adaptive logics are going to be ranking very well in this aspect as well. Especially because if we focus on which is the role that the lower limit logic is, even if this is not classical logic but something like Clune, still the reasoning that will be depicted is one that is going to be as consistent as possible, always trying to go back to consistency. And this has a lot to do with the idea of renormalization of defective information. So defective information is such that at the beginning appears to be inconsistent, but when adding more information, when adding more updates, we realized that actually it was not a real contradiction, but what we had was a messy scenario in which the phenomena was vague or was partial, or there was a conflict but not necessarily a mutually exclusive type of conflict, and then we had the impression that we were reasoning with a contradiction, but now we have more clarity of consistency being put it back in the game, and the phenomenon being better explained by saying, I only had partial information, not very well connected. And so, if we go back to the comparison with dialetheistic logics, what will happen there is that they will not be able to go back to consistency in the strong sense. They will not go back to our classical intuitions as soon as we have more information. For a dialetheistic logic, contradictions are going to be initially assumed to be true, and inconsistencies that were initially accepted in the strong sense cannot be later seen as mistakes, at least not in the same model. So, that said, let's move to some objections to adaptive logics when used in modeling human reasoning. So, one of the main objections that we can get is complexity. So, adaptive logics explicate feasible reasoning forms and approach them within a unifying framework. However, the complaint is that when doing so, the formal mechanisms or the mathematical apparatus is going to be very complex. So, when trying to address human reasoning, they are providing us with models or with logical theories that are going to be very abstract for us, and maybe epistemically opaque to many of the reasoners, the normal reasoners that they were trying to tackle. And so, how can we deal with this? And the basic idea, or the basic response that adaptive logicians have provided, and I am quoting now a paper by Batens, Christophe de Klerk, Peter Verde, and J.Meheus, is that complexity is an issue that concerns logicians. So, adaptive logics are going to be complex because the phenomenon, the type of reasoning, non-monotonic and feasible reasoning, is complex in itself. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that the mathematical apparatus is going to be complex. Nonetheless, this is an issue that has to be discussed in the philosophy of logic, or in logic in particular, but not from an epistemological or philosophical point of view. If we are trying to see if adaptive logics can portray satisfactorily bits of our reasoning when dealing with contradictions, and they do, then we usually cannot track our inferences that well, we as human reasoners. So if there is an epistemic opaqueness around them, it shouldn't surprise us that there is an epistemic opaqueness around the procedures that adaptive logics follow. So that is fine by us. And so that's okay, because human reasoning is complex as well. Now, some good extras coming from the literature of adaptive logics. What I want to say here is a very brief consideration. In the traditional literature, we will see that contradictions are coming from at least three main sources in the sciences. First, either a theory is inconsistent internally, so it contains two assumptions that contradict each other, or a theory is inconsistent with observation. A theory predicts something, that a planet is going to be here, and it ends up being in the opposite way. So that is not a mistake. That can be reconstructed as a contradiction. Or a theory can conflict in a strong sense with another theory, so they can mutually be excluded. That's the traditional view. However, in the adaptive logics literature, we will find other types of contradictions that are tolerated and that are very informative of how we don't make much noise about them, because we are okay with tolerating them. One of those can be related to worldviews. So worldviews are so general, but also have so very clear rules that some of our theories especially our novel theories in something like Kuhn's revolutionary science, might conflict with the old worldview or with the present worldview. The methodologies, when being novel, they also might conflict with the worldview. And we still work with them because we have some type of mechanism that allows us to reason with certain type of logic or certain type of procedures when addressing our methodologies and when addressing the worldviews in a different context. But there is also another example of where these contradictions can be found in the sciences, and this is thought experiments. And for this, I recommend you to look at the Rafal Urbaniak paper, Platonic Thought Experiment, How on Earth, in which he not only defends that adaptive logics are good at helping us to scrutinize thought experiments, but that the contradictions that are in thought experiments are relevant for logicians as well. So that said, the final remarks is, if we look at the phenomena that is significantly important when explaining inconsistency toleration in the sciences, we will find out that there are three main points that any formal tool should be able to address when trying to explain a legitimate case of inconsistency toleration in the sciences, especially in empirical sciences. The first one is contradictions are not expected to be true. And we have seen that the basic apparatus of adaptive logics will help us to deal with this. We also need to have room for updates, for changing the information that we were entailing at the beginning. So we need non-monotonicity in this sense. And adaptive logics are going to be good at this as well. The reliability of consistency, we also need that. And we need a tolerant attitude towards contradiction to be possibly seen as a temporary resource. And adaptive logics will give us the whole picture. So I do believe that adaptive logics are an excellent tool for portraying all this adequately. And some references are here. And that's going to be it. Thank you very much. Gracias, obrigada. And have a nice adaptive logic day. Bye.